today's class, we will be going through the scopes and we'll look into each and every scope one by one. And also what we will do is as in the previous class, we discussed about the differences between var and let, but we only discussed about one primary difference and we had some basic idea about the differences between the scopes of these variables. Okay. But now, once we'll be going through the scopes, we'll also be going through the differences between these two variables as well. Okay. Now, let's talk about the scope first. So we'll be discussing about first category of scope, which is global scope. Okay. So what do you mean by global scope? As the name signifies, everyone has studied in any of the programming languages that let's say if you're declaring any variable outside of the functions inside the class or maybe outside the class as well, you call that variable as the global scope variable, right? And why do we call it as global scope? Because it is accessible. So, I mean, scopes are basically something which you can say which is used to define the accessibility of any of the variables. Okay, let's say if I declared a var, at which position or at which places I can access this variable. So that is something will be defined by the scope. Okay, so basically in one liner, why do we need scope? Because we want the accessibility of the variables or any of the functions declared into a particular program. Okay, so now again coming back to global scope. So obviously, as I already told, global scope is something which is kind of similar in any of the programming languages, which is like you declare a global scope and it will be declared in the global level, or you can say at a global execution context. So execution context is something which we will be covering in further classes. But for now, you can assume that we have, let's say a scope which is like the parent of all the scopes. Okay, so that is something which we call as if let's say we are declaring any variable in that scope, it will be called as global scope. Okay, one of the examples for global scope will be window object. Okay, so this is the global scope object we have. Okay, and how do we know whether this is a global scope object or not? So what I'll do is I'll just bring one more browser over there. And what I'll do is I'll just inspect it. All right. So as I was saying, if you guys remember, okay, I think I didn't cover that in the previous class. So there is something called as window object. Okay, it's like this. You try to print window in the console, it will give you a window object. Okay, and what does that window object consists of? It basically has all the let's say the sub variables or sub functions or classes inside this particular web page will be covered inside this particular window object. So everything will come under this window object. Okay, so if you see, there are a lot of functions or variables declared inside window object. Okay, so this is something which is at a global level in our web page. Okay, so this is one of the examples we can say that this is in the global scope. Okay, now coming back to the point which we were discussing. So I hope everyone is clear on the global scope. Now let's also talk about the differences between the var and let in this as well. Okay, so how do var and let variables behave in the global scope? So let's say, what is the global scope? First of all, let's say I say var a equals to 10, then I have something called as console.log 10. Okay, similarly I'll say let b equals to 20, I'll say console.log b. Okay, so console.log is something you can assume it as something similar to system.out.println in Java, cout in C++, similarly printf I think in C. Okay, So it is kind of similar thing in JavaScript. Okay. So console.log is to use for printing anything. Okay. In the terminal or console. So now coming back to the example which we were looking at. So we declared two variables. Okay. Okay. One more thing before I just talk about it. So I just realized there is one thing which I could tell you in this, which is like in JavaScript, you don't need a semicolon. Okay. So semicolon is not mandatory in JavaScript. You can skip semicolon and still it will work. So if you see in this line, I have not added semicolon, but still it will work. Okay. So now coming back to the topic which we were discussing. So it's like we were discussing about the global scope, right? So anything which is declared at a global scope, because let's say there was a possibility that I could have created a function and then I could have created a variable, right? Something like this. So anything which is declared out of this function or maybe a class will be called as global scope. Okay. So if I try to execute this particular code in this browser console, if you see, we are getting 10 and 20 as a value, right? So you might be now wondering, what is the difference between these? Both are working in the same fashion, right? And you are able to access both the variables inside it, correct? Now, let's discuss about the difference in this. Okay. And this is something which is asked in the interview questions as well. If you guys remember, I told you guys that var is into the global scope and let is not into the global scope. What does this particular thing mean? Is that, as I told, that if you want to access the variable, you can access by its name directly, right? But what does the global scope mean? It basically means I can access window.a as well. But if I do window.b, it will give me an error because so what happens is in JavaScript, if I say anything is in global scope, what will happen is the global scope will be basically that variable or the function will be created inside the window object. So if I try to copy these two lines and I try to print it over it. So if you see, in the case of window.a, we got 10, right? But in the case of window.b, we got undefined because b is not defined in the global scope. So if you want to see and visualize what does that mean, you might be able to find your a variable inside this window. Okay, so if I try to open it, you might be able to find this. If you see, a is created in this, right? But b is not created anywhere. Okay, so that is one of the differences between var and let. Okay, if someone asks you that, you might be like saying that, okay, var is a global scope variable, let will not be a global scope, but they might give you this example and they might say we are able to access both the variables, right? But you can show them this example and tell them that this is the actual difference. So window.a will be accessible, but window.b will not be accessible because let will not be declared in the window object, which is like it is not a global scope variable. Okay, am I clear on it? This is one of the basic examples and the difference between both the variables. Guys, am I clear? Raise the hand first of all. Then I'll move to the next logic. All right. So I think Zephin and Vishnu, I think you guys didn't join the previous class. So there might be a possibility that you are not able to grasp everything in this. So what I'll do is I'll send the recording for the previous session, and I've already shared the notes in the group. Okay, Vishnu, I think you are not in the Slack group, so you can join Slack and you will be able to get the notes as well. And the class link for the previous recording, you will be able to get the link as well in that particular group. Okay. And after that, if you try to reconcile everything, whatever you have learned in this class, you'll be able to understand. Okay. But before that, this is something which is not really dependent on anything else. So was this particular thing clear to you guys as well? Raise the hand if it was clear. Awesome. Awesome. Cool. All right, guys. So now let's move to the second type of scope, which is the functional. So what does a functional scope mean? You might be wondering. I mean, you can just try to understand by its name as well, which is like function is involved in this, right? So what does a functional scope mean? So functional scope is something which is like limited to a function, okay? And it is not accessible outside the function, okay? So this is the basic syntax of how we declare a function, but we'll cover functions in a separate session. But for now, assume that this is how we declare functions, okay? And yeah. So, and what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to declare the two type of variables inside it. Okay. And what I'll do is I'll just copy the console logs. Okay. So what I've done is I've created a function. Okay. And I have declared two variables inside it. One is var type, another one is let type. And I have declared, I've tried to access both the variables inside it. Okay. So now if I try to call function A, let us see what will be the output. So if you see, we are able to access both the variables. Now, you might be thinking that in this case as well, will var be created inside the window object? This should be the question in your mind, right? Because var is a global scope variable, right? Am I clear to everyone? Do you understand what I'm trying to ask? So what do you think? What should happen in this case? Can someone tell me what will be happening in this case?
नहीं होगा.
All right. And why? What could be the reason behind that?
Global नहीं है ना.
Sorry.
It's not global. It's functional. So won't be there.
Okay. So all right. Okay. Yeah. Obviously, it will not be created. Let's see that as well. So if you try to see that there is no C variable created in this, okay, right? Where was C, right? So now it is very important to understand and remember this concept that if anything is declared inside a functional scope, right, it will not be accessible outside of that scope. So for example, if I say I want to do console.log and I want to print C in this, you might say that var is a global scope variable, right? And you might say that this will work, but it will not actually work. It will throw an error because it is not really defined outside of that scope. So it is very important. Anything declared inside a functional scope will not be accessible outside of that scope. Okay. Is that particular point clear? Am I clear on it? So let's see what will be the output for this. So if you see, I'm getting C is not defined, right? Which is expected because something which is declared inside a scope will not be accessible outside of that scope. Okay. So I hope that part is also clear. Okay. Guys, am I clear? Raise the hand quickly. All right. Now let's move to the next sort of scope which we have, which is a block scope. So what does a block mean in JavaScript? Anything written inside the curly brackets is called as block. Okay, first thing. Now let's try to understand the scope of the variables in this as well. Okay.
Console.log is another function, or it will be the function scope.
Sorry, can you come again?
Error C is not defined in last one.
Yeah.
Is it the function of first one, or is it a separate one, that console?
This is with this particular function. It is outside of that function, first of all. And we are trying to access a variable which is declared inside this particular function. Okay. So
Okay.
anything that is declared inside will not be accessible outside that function. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. Am I clear now?
Yeah, right.
All right. Let's move to the next thing. So in terms of the block, if you write anything inside a curly brackets, this will be basically considered as a block scope. Okay. Now let's see for the different variables. Guys, please pay attention because this is something very important and very, I mean, tricky kind of question, which generally is asked in the interviews. I can definitely say that most of you in this particular class, whoever are present, right? If I ask the same question after, let's say, maybe a few weeks, you might get confused in this. So this is important that you guys should actually go ahead and revise and also try to pay attention completely in the class as well. Okay. So now in this block scope, if I try to access these variables, right, what will happen? Will it throw any error or will it work completely fine? Raise the hand and let me know quickly. All right. Yeah. Who raised the hand? I didn't see that. Can you tell me whoever raised the hand? You can just unmute and say. Yeah, Jeffin, tell me.
It will execute.
Right. It will execute. Okay, my bad. I tried to access the same variables twice, so that's the reason I did it. If you see, it is working completely fine, right? Now, the tricky question in this. What will happen in this case? If I try to access the variables which are declared inside this particular block, will it be accessible or will it not be accessible? What will be the output for each line? Who's gonna tell me? Raise the hand. Try to maybe bring in your thought process and okay. Yes, Tisha. Tell me.
Accessible.
Both the
It
variables?
can, yes.
Anyone else would like to say anything else? Yes, Pratik, tell me.
It won't be accessible. Scope.
Sorry?
It won't be accessible. It will throw an error.
Okay. 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 All right. All right. So both of you are correct. And now how both of you are correct, I answer that. Okay. So let's go on. Let's try. It is accessible, right? So Tisha told it will be accessible, right? So E is accessible. Now, Prateek told it will not be accessible. It's not accessible, right? So now I hope you got the another difference in between var and let, right? Anything that is declared inside a block, var doesn't really care about the block scope. It only cares about the functional scope or the global scope. Okay. But let cares about the block scope as well. So if something which is declared as var in block scope, it will be accessible outside of that as well. Okay.
So can you
And-
tell me 1 second, sir?
Yeah. Okay. I'll reiterate what I said. So var really doesn't care about the block scope. Okay. So there is nothing called as block scope for var. Okay. For let, block scope is there and it will also care for it. So if something which is declared as var in a block scope, it will be accessible outside that block as well. But something that is declared as let in that block will not be accessible outside of that scope. Okay. Is the difference clear? Guys, is the difference clear?
Yes, sir.
All right. So you might say that in the case of block scope, it will be treated as a global scope variable. Okay. Let's also verify that inside the window object. Is there any E present? Yes, E is present. Right? Clear, right? Now, before I hope differences are clear. I hope scopes are clear now to everyone, right?